And then he sent me an image of this truly, truly incredible papyrus. It looked like something that would have been discovered in the early 20th century. And I started working on it and eventually realized that it was Euripides.
Welcome to Lesche, a podcast on new ideas in ancient Greek studies. I'm your host, Johanna Hanning, and I'm a classicist at Brown University. This is a podcast for the sharing of new ideas about ancient things, so it's incredibly exciting for me that we get to start off with a conversation about some new ancient texts, with two of those texts' first editors. Just last month, in August 2024, the editio princeps of a newly discovered papyrus, with lines from two plays of Euripides, appeared in ZPE. Most of those lines were previously unknown, which makes this some pretty big news for our field. There's been some furor in recent years around the ethics concerning the publication of literary papyri. I won't get into it, but if you know, you know. So I'm very glad to be able to say that this Egyptian literary papyrus has a secure provenance and has been ethically published. The new papyrus, which was excavated in Egypt at the ancient necropolis of Philadelphia in November of 2022, contains lines from two of Euripides' lost plays. There are 37 verses from the Ino and 60 from the Poluidos. The physical papyrus is also hugely important as a material object, given how the text is arranged on it, and what it might have to tell us about ancient reading and scholarly practices, and we'll be getting into all of that during the conversation. Now, we did know about the existence of these two plays before the new papyrus was discovered, and the lines preserved on it even overlap a little bit with the fragments that we already had, and that's interesting in itself. But all told, these 100 or so lines of Euripides tell us quite a bit that is new about the Ino and Poluidos. A little about the play's plots, but actually quite a lot about some of the characters. There's been some interesting work done lately on fragmentary Greek drama. I think, for example, of Lindsay Koo and Patrick Finglass's 2022 edited volume, Female Characters in Fragmentary Greek Tragedy, and of another volume edited by Lindsay, along with my good buddy Anna Ulig, on the fragments of Aeschylean satyr drama. And that's the 2019 BIC supplement called Aeschylus at Play. Scholars such as these have been reminding us that, when it comes to dramatic fragments, there really is a lot that can be done in the way of interpretation. In the conversation that follows, you'll hear a little bit about some of the questions and directions that this new papyrus and these new fragments of Euripides have been opening up. So it's a pleasure and truly an honor to welcome into the Lesche my guests for this debut episode. They're Yvona Trnka-Amrhein and John Gibert, two of the co-editors, along with Dr. Bessem Gehad of the Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities, of the editio princeps of this new Euripides. Yvona is assistant professor of classics at the University of Colorado Boulder. She works on Greek literature of the Hellenistic and Roman Imperial periods, literary papyrology, the culture of Ptolemaic and Roman Egypt, and the reception of Greek narrative literature in Armenian historiography. Her current book project, Portraits of Pharaohs, studies the historical fictions of Greco-Roman Egypt. Yvona also co-directs the City of the Baboon Project at Hermopolis Magna in Middle Egypt. What a great name. I would definitely visit that city. John Gibert is professor of classics at the University of Colorado Boulder. He writes mainly on archaic and classical Greek poetry, especially drama. He's the author of Euripides' Ion, so that's a green and yellow from 2019, as well as of Change in Mind in Greek Tragedy from 1995. He's also co-author, along with Christopher Collard and Martin Kropp, of Euripides' Selected Fragmentary Tragedies 2 from 2004. John has been involved in productions of ancient plays at the Denver Center for the Performing Arts and the University of Colorado's Department of Theater and Dance. And finally, just a quick note that I'll be putting a bunch of references and resources in the show notes for the episode. So now I'd like to welcome into the Lesche Yvona Trnka-Amrhein and John Gibert. The first voice you'll be hearing next is Yvona's.
Personally, I had always wanted to work on a project in Egypt, and through a series of fortuitous circumstances, I was introduced to my current collaborator, Bassem Gahad, who's an Egyptian archaeologist specializing in Ptolemaic and Roman Egypt, who works for the Ministry of Antiquities and Tourism. And his official job is the head of the training centers, so he helps members of the Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities learn how to excavate, learn best practices. But he is running his own project in the Philadelphia necropolis, and this is a project that he's been running for several years now. And the way I became involved is that one of my specialties is papyrology. So he very generously said, "Hey, I'm finding papyri in Philadelphia. Would you like to edit them with me?" And then, incredibly, in November 2022, it was Thanksgiving. I remember this because I was supposed to be with my family, etc. He sent me an image of this truly incredible papyrus. It looked like something that would have been discovered in the early 20th century, and I started working on it and eventually realized that it was Euripides. Where it comes from in the necropolis is the Roman section of the cemetery. So Bassem has figured out that there is the village, the ancient village of Philadelphia, and then there are some mountains nearby. And it seems like the burials started in the mountain region in the early Ptolemaic period when the city was founded. It probably was an Egyptian city before the Greeks came there, but it is considered a Ptolemaic foundation under Ptolemy II, hence Philadelphia. So the earliest burials, the Ptolemaic burials, are in the mountains, but then as the cemetery expanded, it sort of crept closer and closer towards the town. So this papyrus comes from a 3rd century CE grave from this Roman part of the necropolis, so the area that is closer to the town. And very interestingly, the grave that it comes from seems to be pretty low status. It was just a very simple pit grave. It had 2 mummies in it, one of a woman in her early 40s, or between 40 and 45, according to the analysis of the bones, and then also a child. And it's much harder to actually date the bones of a child or to sex the bones of a child. So we just know that it was a child. And this pit grave was part of a cluster, what Bassem and his team are calling a graveyard, a later graveyard that was dug around a more prestigious funerary structure of the earlier Roman period, of the 1st to 2nd century CE. So it seems like in the Roman period, the citizens of Philadelphia moved their necropolis, as said, closer to the town and really made it a literal necropolis, a literal city with avenues and sort of tombs placed on the avenues like houses. It doesn't seem like the tombs in ancient Philadelphia are actually constructed to be houses the way they are, for instance, in Tuna el Gebel, which is a Roman period necropolis further south. But yeah, this Roman cemetery really seems like a city of the dead. And then later, when Philadelphia seems to have gone into decline, like many places in Egypt, in the 3rd century and later, people started digging smaller graves around it, and that's where the papyrus was found, in one of these smaller, lower status graves.
So what would the papyrus have been doing in this grave? I mean, was it something that they wanted to be buried with? Because it's not, I mean, we're not talking about like with the Posidippus cartonnage situation, right? So this was actually buried alongside rather than wrapped around these people, right? Yes,
yeah. So it's not cartonnage. It was just part of a deposit of sort of clumped up papyri in one side of the grave. And what it's doing there is an open question, certainly. So it was there with at least 4 other papyrus documents. There are a couple of scraps, and I'm trying to figure out whether it's part of the same document or 2 different documents. So we'll say about four documents, and they're all documentary texts. None of them are literary as far as we can tell. And so far we haven't found a connection any sort of thematic connection, any sort of personal connection that links these documents or all of these papyrus texts. And so, it was in the fill of the grave. So it's possible, I think personally, that it's most likely that these papyri had been taken to the necropolis for reuse in some sort of process. I mean, in the Roman period, we don't really see cartonnage made from papyri. We don't have that use of papyrus for cartonnage the way we do in the Ptolemaic period. So not for that purpose necessarily, but for some other industrial purpose in the necropolis. Maybe this waste papyrus was collected and then it was blown around. It's very windy in Philadelphia. And maybe it was just trash blowing around the necropolis and it just got put in there. Another hypothesis for it's just being trash is that in the fill of the grave, there were also lots of fragments of painted plaster that seem to come from that higher status mausoleum that I mentioned this later graveyard is surrounding. So it seems possible to me, and I don't know if we could ever prove this, that the Euripides Papyrus could have been in that mausoleum, which might have made more sense to me, and that if it was deposited somewhere, it would have been deposited in a higher status grave, just because of the statistics of literacy, etc., in the ancient world, and maybe it just got thrown in this grave with the rest of the reused, destroyed material. But I know that some people really would like to connect the contents of the Euripides plays, especially the Poluidos, which is about the resurrection of a child, to the fact that there is a woman and a child in this grave. And I mean, that's so tempting. But I do wonder if that would be too good to be true. There's a question too of why you would have the Ino in there with this
there's a
murder
big, I mean,
of children.
especially given the subject matter of the Ino, there is a sort of a strange juxtaposition there. Maybe if that.
Yeah.
But is it known whether the female mummy, is she the mother? I mean, is it presumed that she is the mother of this child, or? I
mean, we can't know for sure. That seems very likely that the child and the woman are related somehow, and mother and child seems the most likely connection. Yes.
Right. So can you walk me through, and John jump into what happened next? So how do we, if you think about like how a bill becomes a law, how does a scrap of papyrus in a tomb become an article in ZPE?
Yeah, so when the papyrus was found, it was pretty mashed up. It doesn't seem like it was folded in any sort of precise way, the way amulets can be, which to me is another piece of evidence for it not necessarily being deposited there intentionally. But the first step was for Bessem to conserve the papyrus, and he's also trained in conservation in addition to being an archaeologist. So he did a fabulous job on unfolding the papyrus. We wouldn't say unroll because it was, sort of in like a packet shape. So he unfolded the papyrus and straightened a lot of it out and put it between glass, which is how papyri are mostly conserved these days. And then he took high-resolution images, sent them to me. I started working on the images, and I started from at the right-hand column. There are two columns of text, and the right-hand column is much better preserved, and the bottom is the most legible part. So I started from the most legible part and basically started reading backwards to forwards because that was the easiest way. And as I started reading the papyrus, and the hand is really not bad. It's quite nice to read. It's not a sort of documentary personal cursive. I mean, it's probably a personal copy. We think it's probably a personal copy of somebody, but it's a relatively nice hand, relatively easy to use. And just from the language, it's absolutely literature. It's absolutely poetry. And then as I was looking at it, it seemed like there were a lot of Euripidean phrases, and my first thought was probably Euripidean imitator, right? Because there's a lot of that in the later periods. But as I kept reading, I was checking with the TLG, obviously, and I found a match with one of Plutarch's quotations of Euripides without attribution to play. So that was fabulous. And then I kept reading, and I got a hit with a quotation that was attributed to Poluidos. And then I realized that there was an inset title on the first column, which was Poluid. Eventually, when we went in person to look at the papyrus, it was clearly Poluidu. But then I realized, okay, this is very, very important and a very, very exciting find. And I thought it would be imperative to call in somebody who works on Euripidean fragments, and fortuitously there was John down the hall. So we started working pretty intensively on the text, and it was so convenient just to go down the hall and knock on John's door. And maybe I'll let you carry on the story there.
Right, or I could walk down the hall too.
Yes. Yeah.
So it's just been a fabulous collaboration. And as we proceeded to some of the more difficult to read sections of the text, badly abraded is the main reason in the first column. Also, the first column is missing 2 to 4 letters on the left, and the left margin is not preserved. So that was much harder, but as we worked on it, we were still looking for hits. And now we also had a big clue, which is that there were very few names anywhere in the papyrus, but that one that was inset was either going to be a speaker attribution or more likely a title. And that would suggest then that what follows is from that play and what precedes is from a different play. And sure enough, before long, we had a hit with a fragment attributed to Ino. We later found another unattributed fragment also in the Ino section, so we were able to place 3.5 or 4 more lines into their proper play on that basis. And then we just got down to work trying to read those badly abraded letters and supplement the gaps at the left-hand margin. And as Yvona says, it was months of intensive work poring over letters and checking words for their frequency and attestation and making sure we had the meter right, of course, and all those things. And we began to produce a pretty readable text by the spring of 23, and we decided then to think about ways to involve other people in the discovery and exactly how we could roll it out for the benefit of the scholarly world and the public and so forth. So
yeah, I have so many questions about that process. First, John, could you just maybe say a little bit about, because the ZPE article contains very interesting remarks on the disposition of the text, on the sort of width of the columns and what that suggests about perhaps the use or who produced this, who read it. Could one of you say a little bit more about just sort of what are we talking about in terms of the size, how many lines of Greek, what are these columns like?
Well, I'll take that. So it's sort of an unusual format, as said, and it doesn't seem to be a book for the book market, right? And William Johnston's very meticulous study of the literary papyri from Oxyrhynchus has shown that there were really sort of fashions in book production. So you can say with some confidence whether a book is a high status, expensive product for the market, or whether it's a more personal copy. And from those bibliological features of the papyrus, it really seems like it's some sort of personal copy. I already talked about the handwriting. It's a nice handwriting, but it's not calligraphic by any means. But it's also not a scribble. Right, it's a nice sort of very usable handwriting. I think the most interesting thing there is the question of what are these two excerpts doing on this papyrus? Are they connected? Where do they come from, etc.? But in terms of figuring out who the person is who produced the papyrus, I think the third kind of marginal note that we see in the right-hand column, the left margin of the right-hand column, is particularly interesting. The one that seems to indicate where passages on the papyrus coincide with the quotation tradition. Right, the tradition that we see in Stobaeus and the tradition that we use to identify this papyrus as Euripides and Euripides Papyrus. That to me is very unusual. I've talked to several papyrologists. No one has seen anything similar. And it strikes me that this person really knew something about the Euripidean tradition, right? To say, okay, these are quotable lines that are in Stobaeus, or what, I mean, not Stobaeus, obviously, but the tradition that preceded Stobaeus.
It's kind of like that feature in Kindle, right, where if you highlight something, it'll be like, 346 other people have highlighted this.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, John, could you maybe say a bit more about just, as you were both deciphering this and as you find, as it clarified or crystallized just what you had on your hands? I mean, what were your first reactions, particularly as a Euripidean?
Yes, I'd love to answer that question. I also want to build just a little bit on Yvona's last answer. Additional features that show that we've got a serious student or scholar of Euripides producing this text are that there are a few variant readings, and they're intelligent. There are very few errors, and there's even an intriguing interlinear designation that we've deciphered as exo. And we can't make any other sense of it other than to speculate that it's asking the reader to turn the document over and look on the outside of the roll. And maybe there was intended to be a correction, a note, something of the kind. Now, we haven't found it on the other side, but that's also very rare. It suggests there could have been coordination with another document, a commentary, or something of that kind too, if not the same document on the other side. But in terms of starting to get a sense of the significance, we were all about Poluidos for a while before we had found the Ino coincidences with the quotation tradition. So I will admit that I had to read up pretty quickly on Poluidos. He's not a household name, although it turns out he has a very interesting mythological tradition, and he belongs to the most famous Greek family of seers, the Melamputids, and he's from the Peloponnese, and this is his main story, actually, the one that was dramatized, as we quickly learned, not only by Euripides, but by Aeschylus and Sophocles. And there's a comedy by the name of Poluidos by Aristophanes. So this led us very quickly to a very expert work by one of our Italian colleagues, collecting all this material between two covers. And we thought, well, fascinating, a story of bringing a boy back from the dead. We're going to have ritual connections, religious thought, as well as good old Euripidean themes. And we began wondering whether we were going to get precious new information into the plot of this play. So all we have to go on hitherto is mythographers. So the library attributed to Apollodorus has a version of this story. And then there's also one in one of the fabulae of Hyginus, usually thought to be writing in Latin around 200 CE. And they show some differences between them, which is not surprising now that I've mentioned that we know there were plays by the other two big tragedians as well. And then the Apollodorus version in particular has an interesting coda that we don't know whether it was part of the play or not, or just part of the mythological tradition. So, there's always this difficulty in knowing how far you can rely on these mythographical summaries. In the case of Ino, just to jump tracks and get ahead of myself a little bit, it's a little bit easier because there are only two fabulae in Hyginus' entire corpus which bear a title attributing the story he tells to a particular author. And they're both attributed to Euripides. The other one is Antiope, And then there's this one attributed to the Ino of Euripides. So thought to be a little bit more reliable, but still poses some thorny problems. So what we found out about the Poluidos excerpt is that it's probably more informative about character and themes than about plot. We already knew from the quotation tradition that the scene that we seem to have on the papyrus was the most remembered, the most plundered for quotable quotes. And so that's why there are the correspondences that helped us identify the text. But it also meant that we pretty much knew we were squarely within a confrontation between political authority, the king, and religious authority, the seer. And classic Euripidean motif, it may or may not be a formal agon. That's a question that one of our Washington participants devoted herself to, so people will be able to read about that very soon. But the really interesting stuff in the Poluidos, I think Yvona will agree, was about the character of King Minos, the possible insight into a role for Queen Pasiphae, the way that Minos differs a little bit from the way he's portrayed in another fragmentary play of Euripides, the Cretans, and the interaction with the secondary tradition of writers like Plato, who has an interesting relationship, as you know, to Crete, and has some words comparing the Athenian tragic Minos with the one known from other sources, the wise judge and the afterlife and so on. And so that's stuff that we've been really digging into, especially Yvona, for our forthcoming interpretation to accompany the edition. And before I move on to Ino, I'll just say, too, that a question that occupied us very early on was, are we looking at continuous text? Are these excerpts representing continuous script from the portion of the play they're drawn from? And it's not an easy question to answer. And we've actually taken what's proving to be an unpopular position on this, but it's also proven to be very productive of debate and dialogue. So we're going to persist, at least for a while. And we think that we can make a case for continuity of both excerpts. And then questions follow like, well, then why these scenes and what's special about them? But because of the marginal signs and because of some places where continuity within the text is a little challenging because of either thought or even just formal connection through particles, many of our colleagues, most of our colleagues, are disagreeing with us on this point so far. But we can come back to this later if you want. We think there are some questions that we're all thinking about, obviously, but that we want them to think really hard about, because we obviously considered the possibility, too, that the text was discontinuous. And we decided that the case was worth making, that it just might be two continuous scenes.
So by discontinuous in this instance, you mean that it was that in that case it would be like a series of excerpts?
Excerpts within excerpts, which, by the way, would be unique in the anthological tradition as far as we know. So this is clearly an anthology. You can say that just by virtue of the fact that we have two plays in it. But an anthology of what? And at an early period, we have anthologies that are based on formal criteria, like prologues or choral entrance songs. And then later on, we tend to get anthologies that are more based on content, on themes like misogyny, marriage, things of this kind. And this would not be either one of those, right? It would be somebody working very closely with just two plays that we have evidence for and making a series, long series, 60 lines, 60 trimeters from Poluidos of excerpts that appear to be in the correct narrative order and in some cases pose no problem at all for continuity, but in a few cases seem a little jumpy from one section to the next. And there are those marginal signs, the ones we call forked paragraphoi, that do coincide with strong punctuation in all 13 cases where they appear on the papyrus. And so that's consistent with excerpts within excerpts, but it's also consistent with other hypotheses, such as marking the text up, chunking it for performance, or drawing attention to rhetorically effective bits. So this is all still under discussion. You
forgot my pet hypothesis, which it doesn't have much evidence behind it, but I want it to be a commentary. And just sort of thinking about the way some other commentary texts will sort of, when we actually, so we never have the text and the commentary together, right? That's just a huge, huge problem of what exactly is happening with an ancient commentary. We never have that pair the way we would have in a modern OCT and an accompanying commentary, or green and yellow, where you'd have the text and commentary together. But in papyrus commentaries where we have the comments section, the lemmata are frequently indicated by forked paragraphoi. And so my secret or not so secret dream is that this is a text that would have been, there would be a coordinated commentary, and the forked paragraphoi are signaling, oh, this is an interesting bit, or oh, there's a comment here.
Are you thinking the exo maybe plays into that story?
I mean, that would be amazing. That would be amazing. So on the other side of the Euripides, which is actually the horizontal fiber side of the papyrus, so the side of first use, there is a land survey, which Brian McGing has been editing. And there are some puzzling extra lines that don't necessarily seem to be connected to the land survey and are in a hand that's very, very temptingly similar to the Euripides. But Brian believes that the symbols for Artabai in there, or Arurai, excuse me. And so it seems like it's probably not the comments on the Euripides that one would hope for. Yeah. So that's a puzzle and frustrating.
And pardon me for leaving that out, but I think it's also worth making the point that on any of these theories, this document seems to be unique. As I say, we have other anthologies of different kinds, but nothing quite like this on any of the theories we've just been talking about.
Yeah, so it seems like even apart from the actual content of the lines, that this is kind of an extraordinary papyrus in terms of these formal features, you might say, or what it's perhaps contributing to our picture of ancient reading practices, ancient scholarly practices, and so on. Well, John, you mentioned Washington.
Yes.
And could you say a little bit about perhaps that conference and maybe more generally how you decided to start rolling this out, which is a terrible papyrological pun, I guess. Yvonne, right. You did say it was unfolded, not unrolled. But yeah, I'm curious about, because you must have kept it close to your vest for a certain amount of time. And so which must have been thrilling in a way, right? Yes. But, what was the calculus in terms of, okay, how do we start presenting this?
Right. No, we were very cloak and dagger for a long time. But we had these big grins on our faces too all the time, because
someone referred to the your DC conference as that secret Euripides conference.
It was. We asked them to keep a lid on it too. We did, and so we knew that we had a document of enormous significance and interest, and that we were going to have the chance to be the first editors along with our Egyptian colleague, and that was thrilling enough. So we wanted to be fast for one thing. Didn't want to take 44 years. And we wanted to be completely proper in terms of not speaking to the press and leaking little details before we could actually provide evidence for what we were saying. And of course, we're very fortunate to have a very solid provenance story, legally and scientifically excavated. That was a big part of it. So we thought we have an extraordinary opportunity here. We do want to have some experts to talk with us about this text and to begin to make further improvements to our work and to get ready to, reveal it to the world. So early on, I guess it was probably around May of 2023, we sought the support of the Center for Hellenic Studies, because it's a great venue for this kind of thing, and they've been so generous and helpful. But they, of course, are a satellite of Harvard University. They can invite people from all around the world. They can house them, feed them, provide first-rate conference facilities, and publish a book afterwards. And a feature of interest to us also was that the books they publish are online and open access, and also available for low cost as print paperbacks. So that's another aspect of rolling it out to the world.
Did you follow the Pausanias model? Because that was also CHS, right? And it's a CHS
Yes.
publication then.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, and also the Sappho on old age, they had sort of done this before. Yeah.
Exactly. That was very influential in our thinking at that time. And we kept thinking of people we wanted to invite. And of course, we're also very aware of the fact that we couldn't invite everybody we would like to. But they just kept saying, sure. And so we got up to 15, counting the 3 of us who were first editors. So the 12 others came from Ireland, the UK, Italy, Greece, of course, specimens from Egypt, and I think that, and the US, and we originally had a Canadian participant who, for health reasons, wasn't able to join us in person. So an international conference of experts in a variety of sub-disciplines related to the work. So definitely a solid core of people who are working hard on improving the text, making better supplements than ours, or different ones anyway, and making new discoveries too. We're actually discovering that we read a letter incorrectly. That may have happened as recently as yesterday, but I'll put that aside for the moment. But we also wanted to be sure to include people who work on reconstructing fragmentary plays and who know about the medieval tradition of Euripides plays, and who represent, all the subdisciplines that are vital to the study of Greek tragedy. So kind of a bottom all the way up to the top approach, if the metaphor is allowable. And we think it's useful for all these people to be talking to each other and learning from each other. So we were just thrilled that they enabled us to do everything we wanted with that conference in Washington, except invite, another 200 people. I'm not sure we would have wanted that anyway, but you know what I mean. It was kind of a golden ticket that we were bestowing on some people we knew to be top rate in the discipline and in the subdisciplines. And so we just felt incredibly fortunate.
So was the next phase then the publication?
So, yeah, this is probably worth specifying. Sorry to jump in again. But we did actually complete our work on the first edition in the course of this past winter. And it was already in the pipeline at ZPE with a few contributions from trusted readers who are named and acknowledged in the edition, but with the Washington participants receiving this, but still on hold in terms of making their own contributions.
Okay.
And they now have had a chance to make their contributions. A website will be going live today or tomorrow at the center, which will have preprints from the conference talks, and it'll also have a repertory of conjectures.
Yvona, could I ask you what, from the discussion at that conference, were there sort of avenues of thought, inquiry that opened up that you hadn't anticipated? What kind of came out of that maybe surprised you?
Well, I mean, returning to the subject that John touched on of whether these are excerpts within excerpts or continuous large excerpts, I think I was surprised by how many people were not willing to read them as full excerpts, which is, made me question a lot of the assumptions that I had held for a while after, wondering whether they were non-continuous. I decided, especially for the Poluidos, that I believed they were continuous. So that made me rethink a lot of things, question, whether I still believed in this continuous excerpts theory. And it was very interesting to hear the contributions on the Ino in particular, how people were slotting it into Euripidean practice generally, which I thought was very interesting, partly because I'm coming at it as a papyrologist and not a Euripidean. So it was really interesting to see how people who are focused more on Euripides as a poet were seeing this within the Euripidean landscape. I don't want to spoil anyone's arguments, but Naomi Weiss in particular thinking about this idea of doubling. So it really expanded how I was thinking about the text as literature as opposed to a document that someone in Roman Philadelphia had produced.
So can you say a little bit about your interpretations, though, because you alluded to a more interpretive piece that you have coming out. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
So we sort of split it up in that John is in charge of Ino and I'm in charge of Poluidos. So I'll start with Poluidos and then hand it over to John, I guess. So with the Poluidos, I am still very convinced that it's one continuous excerpt because it does seem to be a confrontation. Well, it is definitely a confrontation between Minos and Poluidos about the morality of resurrecting the dead. And I think that we see Pasiphae, even though we don't necessarily have any of her lines, but I think we see her emerging as an interesting figure in that she's the grieving mother who really, really wants her boy to be restored, obviously, right? But the way we're reading this argument, it seems that it's Pasiphae who's really, really pushing that she thinks that it's possible to resurrect the boy. And in the hypotheses we have of the myth, it definitely seems clear that Poluidos does not know how to do it, right? He gets locked in the tomb, and the snake comes along, he kills the snake, and then another snake comes with the herb, and then resurrects the first snake, and then he has this light bulb moment. This is how I'm going to resurrect the boy. So in those hypotheses of the myth, it seems clear he doesn't know what he's doing. In the papyrus, he never actually says, I can't do it because I can't do it, right? He says, I won't do it because it's not right. And it seems that to us that it's Pasiphae who's really saying this is possible and you have to do it. And Minos is just saying, well, I have got lots of power and money and I'm going to make this underling do what I say. So I think we can see in the background a very interesting role for Pasiphae, even though some of the evidence that we thought, or I thought, was really supporting this position may be interpreted differently, and that's something that we learned from one of the improvements that was made in DC during the conference. But I still think we can see a very interesting role for Pasiphae that's also reflected in Aristophanes' treatment of the Poluidos. So that's really fascinating because we associate Euripides with strong female characters, and Pasiphae should be there somewhere. She plays a very important role in the summaries of the story, and in some senses, we don't have enough characters for this play without her. So she kind of has to be there. But I think the other really interesting thing, as John was alluding to, is how we can possibly see more reception of this Poluidos play, and especially the character of Minos in Plato, or the dialogue that's attributed to Plato called the Minos. Right, and there Socrates says some pretty preposterous things, and one of them is, you probably know this, that Minos has a terrible reputation in Greek tragedy because the ancient Athenians were trying to get revenge for the fact that he was sacrificing their youth. And so we can see a sort of horrible Minos in Euripides' Cretans, where the phrase that I like to use is sort of, he's like a Disney villain. He's just, cackling with, I don't know, greased handlebar mustaches or something.
Like Hades and Disney's Hercules or something.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And here, at least, while he definitely is high-handed, he seems a little bit more rational.
Do people have any thoughts about the datation of this play?
So it's definitely a late one, and John, you should probably take this because it's metrical.
The argument is metrical. It comes down to that. But in fact, this has the trimeter that, out of all the surviving trimeters of ancient Greek tragedy, has the most syllables, because there's a line that has 3 resolutions and an anapestic substitution. And that's unique. So anyway, we don't think Euripides was writing quite that freely in terms of trimeter technique until close to the end of his career.
Okay, so we're talking about the sort of last decade, maybe second to last decade, or last decade of the 5th century. Yeah, I just kept coming back to this passage, and I'll just read from the English translation that you provide, where Minos says, "Poluidos, there is no defense against necessity." I love this passage. And he says, "Don't you see?" It goes on to say, "Don't you see the ocean-dwelling dolphin rules the sea? Among birds, the eagle's strength rules. Zeus has greatest sway in heaven, tyrannies on land. Since you are of lower station, you must endure my misfortunes under compulsion." I mean, this is very like, and the weak suffer what they must, isn't it? I mean, it's very like, Hesiodic, Hawk and the Nightingale, and then that Athenian thesis, that so-called, in Straussian terms, the Athenian thesis that you get in Thucydides. Is this something that has come up? It's just, I mean, because people, for so long have seen Euripides and Thucydides as these kind of kindred spirits in some way. I can't resist asking about how that passage, which is just so sort of vivid and colorful with the animal references, how people have been interpreting that.
Well, that's a passage I particularly love, and I think John does too, but I may jump in here. I haven't been looking at the Thucydidean resonances so much, although you're absolutely right. And at the conference, so one subject that I'm particularly interested in is that in variants of this myth, it's Asclepius who resurrects Glaucus, not Poluidos. And Asclepius makes so much more sense, right? Because he does it. And just also thinking about the actual context of what's happening in Athens, and in particular, the very well-known work about sort of the role of medicine in tragedy, and the fact that you have the sanctuary of Asclepius being brought into Athens, sort of around this time, and being so close to the theater. Why would you choose Poluidos and not Asclepius for this myth? And people at the conference were pointing out to me very correctly that there is a debate between doctors and seers at this time in the sort of historical context, contemporary political context. So I think there's definitely a lot there. But with the animal references, I think what's very, very interesting is that, again, in that Platonic Minos, which I've sort of become a little obsessed with, there is the discussion of the shepherd of men, and the Homeric epithets, and the nice etymological play there that Socrates ends with. And just thinking a little bit about this idea of the king as the good shepherd, or in Homeric terms, more of a problematic shepherd, one who's not necessarily taking care of their flock so much. And I think, especially with all of this animal imagery here, there's something going on about the ethics of rulership that I think Plato is definitely, previously, people definitely thought it was spurious, but now philosophers in particular are coming back and saying the Minos is really Plato's. But whoever wrote the Minos, I think, is possibly seeing something here.
Yeah, there seems to be some, sort of maybe engagement also with the Aesopic kind of fabular tradition. I mean, that just seems like such an incredibly rich passage.
Yeah.
Well, maybe John, could I ask you to talk just a little bit about what directions you're thinking in interpretively with the Ino?
Oh yes, I'd be happy to. May I just tag on a little again to what we were saying about those lines? They are among my favorite. I just want to point out that they're all new, no overlap with quotation tradition there. Also, there was some fancy footwork required to read those lines because of damage on the left-hand side, abrasion really. And there are very few remaining questions, though, about how to read it correctly. So we're kind of tickled with ourselves, but even more so we're tickled with Euripides and with that passage. One of our participants believes that it's not the ocean-dwelling dolphin, which is what the papyrus unmistakably has, but he's going to argue that what Euripides did was he put the ocean adjective with the sea salt, so marine salt, if you will. The dolphin rules the sea salt, because the word for sea is halos. So that kind of discussion is going to be ongoing, but these lines are already beautifully restored as they are. So maybe we'll hear them in Greek later, if you want to. But I'll move on to Ino for a little bit, and I'll go back to one thing that came up very much earlier in our conversation, which is about whether there's any appropriateness to the themes of Ino for burial in a grave. Again, speculation, maybe even unlikely speculation, but it sure would be delightful to believe that this document found its way purposefully into a grave. And of course, Ino is a serial child murderer, so that's not so nice. But she is deified along with her one remaining son in the mythographical tradition right after the events of our play. And that was, of course, probably not part of our play, but it's the sort of thing that Deus Ex Machina might have foretold at the end of our play. And so Ino herself, in a way, has the most distinguished mythical pedigree of any of the characters we're talking about, because she's in the Odyssey as the sea goddess Leucothea, who provides Odysseus with the veil, right, in Book 5 of the Odyssey. And her son was also deified, and the both of them received widespread worship that may even have involved child sacrifice, but that's a little bit of a byway we won't go down right at this moment. But I also want to amplify something Yvona said, and you asked about what we learned from the conference itself. She mentioned Naomi Weiss's terrific paper, also Lindsay Koo's. They both showed how much can be done with fragments, right? And we absolutely wanted this to be part of the conference, even though obviously it requires some speculation and some imagination. Those are good things, right? And so we were amazed how much could be learned by rolling up our sleeves and looking at things that way. I'll also say that another takeaway from the conference is that there is one more theory as to what the text may have been created for, and people are going to read about that on the CHS website, so I won't steal the thunder of the scholar who's proposing one more intriguing theory about what the text is for. Okay, but now to answer your actual question. So we have this outline from Hyginus. It's the only source for the particular story that it tells. And luckily, as I said, it is attributed to the Ino of Euripides. And it looks like one of those plays that's built using familiar components of Euripidean tragedy, but just kind of moving the tiles around and creating new configurations. So one question that people have had for more than 200 years about this plot summary is, hang on a sec, Ino looks like a victim in this narrative, but Ino is better known probably for her role in engineering the attempted sacrifice of Phrixus, or Phrixus and Helle, leading to the story of the golden fleece, the ram with the golden fleece, which is obviously very important Greek myth, very deeply
and the
Hellespont,
rooted. Right? The origin of the Hellespont.
And the Hellespont, when Helle falls off. Exactly. So, I mean, this stuff wasn't it invented by Euripides, obviously. This goes deep into the mythical roots of these stories. So the question that people had was, but if Ino's a victim in this story, are we supposed to remember that earlier she tried to engineer child sacrifice? Because now she's a victim of her rival, a woman who's in the same position that she was previously in, engineering the death of her children to eliminate them as candidates for the succession to the throne. So there's kind of an echo chamber thing going on there, a closet of masks, to use from Zeitlin's evocative phrase. And people have tended, I think, to answer this question mostly in the negative. No, we can forget about that Ino. This is a new Ino that Euripides invented for this plot. And we don't believe it. We don't believe anybody can forget a strand of the mythical tradition that's that important. And we also think that the way the play turns out, and the way Euripides wrote it, is much more suggestive and interesting if, in fact, it's more of a Medea-like situation where she hoodwinks you for a while into thinking that she's a sympathetic victim character, But then she emerges as a woman capable of murdering not just any children, but her own children. And she vaunts a little bit over Jason after imposing that loss on him. And so we think that Ino emerges from new lines on the papyrus as a character who very much stands comparison with Medea. And who, by the way, you asked about dates before, may date to a similar period of Euripides' career, because in this case we have a terminus antiquem from jokes in Aristophanes, Acarnians, and Wasps. So this is a play from, let's say between 435 and 425. So anyway, I'll tell you what I think we learned, and it's not so much about the plot, but it's in the first instance about character. So we haven't even mentioned that there was another new Ino papyrus 12 years ago, published in the Oxyrhynchus series, first edition of a papyrus that had been lying around and then was identified tentatively identified as coming from Ino. And then one of our Washington participants endorsed and expanded on that assignment. And he wrote at length about unanswered questions about Ino's character. And we think the papyrus answers one of the questions he asked, which is, how did she feel about feeling that she had to cause the death of two innocent children in order to avoid her rival succeeding in killing her own children? So in a way it was self-defense. Did she feel bad about it? Did she wish she could have avoided it? Well, what we think we have in a magnificent section of the first column is 8 lines, 7 preserved on the papyrus and 1 that we want to put back in there for complicated reasons, in which Ino vaunts over her victim, her rival, and basically says, you got what you had coming. You tried to kill my children? Well, mwahahaha, I killed your children instead. And so this was a great insight into her character, and again, invites the comparison with Medea.
Yeah, it's definitely giving Medea.
Yeah, and that seems very clear from what's on the papyrus. A couple of more speculative things. How did the rival plan to get rid of Ino's children? Well, the plot summary in Hyginus says that it was through a costume trick. The children of the rival were supposed to be dressed in white, and the children of Ino were supposed to be dressed in black, and somehow this would result in the death of the ones dressed in black. The trouble was that the rival confided her evil scheme to none other than Ino, who we know from the plot summary was in disguise as an enslaved person in the palace at this point. So, bad move. Ino just obviously switches the costumes, dressing her own children in white and her rival's children in black, and somehow the trick comes off in this unintended fashion, resulting in the death of the rival's children. And then the rival, of course, commits suicide when she learns what she has either done or caused to be done. So the question is, how is the dirty deed supposed to be done? And there have been 2 theories out there, and probably the more popular one up till now has been that it was a nursery trick. These were bedclothes or onesies or something that the children were wearing in the nursery. And somebody was supposed to sneak in there and smother the ones dressed in black and let the ones dressed in white live. There's some problems with that, but there is also one good mythical parallel. It's not attested for a tragedy. We think there's some difficulties with making this work as a tragic scenario, but it's not an unappealing scenario. It's just a sordid murder in that case. Somebody's, killing babies in the crib. The other possibility, which had only been put forward tentatively because there are some challenges with it too, is that it was a sacrificial trick. Somebody engineered a sacrificial crisis so that the children dressed in black were going to become victims of ritual killing, and the ones dressed in white were going to be spared. Now, I have to say right off the top, we favor this scenario, but we have to admit that we don't have any attestation of dressing sacrificial victims in black. We're still looking, so anybody who's listening, let us know if you're familiar with one. But the advantages of this scenario, though, are that it's very typical of tragedy to make ritual killing dressed in to make plain murder dressed in ritual guise, as if it's a sacrifice to the gods. And in particular, in the family of Ino's husband, whom we haven't named yet, he's Athamas, king of Thessaly in Euripides' play, sometimes located in Boeotia. Athamas is at the center of a whole nexus of stories that involve human sacrifice. His son Phrixus, obviously, the one that Ino herself tried to have killed in a ritual sacrifice, Athamas himself, and descendants of Athamas. This is a lot of smoke, and we think that there's fire here in the form of Euripides picking up on this sacrificial motif and using it for his play. And conveniently for us, we have thumata, sacrificial victims or acts of sacrifice, plain as day in the second line of the papyrus. That doesn't prove our preference, of course, because you can call any murder victim a sacrificial victim in Greek tragedy, whether or not there was a full-blown altar and ritual killing. But we do think that it's helpful to the case.
It doesn't disprove it. So
yeah, it doesn't disprove it. We think it's helpful to that case. So in our interpretation, we're laying out the sacrifice scenario, all the background I mentioned in the mythographical tradition about other sacrifices, some of which we know is dramatized by Sophocles, also, a key point in our argument, and so forth. So we think we can run a little distance with sacrifice, but we can't ultimately prove it. And then there's an even more speculative piece, and then I'll stop. But there is a clear reading of the word tomb in line 15, I think, of the first column. Anyway, it's not clear what that tomb is doing there. These lines are badly abraded, and we're not convinced that anybody has yet made perfect sense of them. But they're very interesting lines, and it's too soon for there to be tombs of any of the children who die within the play. Okay, so there's going to be at least 3, and they'll eventually have tombs or not. There's a 4th one who's going to be deified. He has lots of tombs because he has many cult sites, but it's too early for any of that to be mentioned. Especially if it's a continuous excerpt, but even if it's a series of excerpts in order, there's just no reason to be mentioning those tombs yet. So whose tomb is it? And we can only speculate, but we have speculated because it's fun, and we think it might be the tomb of Phrixus. So first we have to show that even though Phrixus wasn't killed, we all know that he got away on the ram with the golden fleece, he could still have a tomb. That's pretty easy to demonstrate. That tomb could be a place where an angry ghost rises up and demands a human sacrifice. That's exactly what happens in Euripides' Hecuba, where the ghost of Achilles demands the sacrifice of Polyxena. And so we think that's a plausible scenario. And then this scenario would require Ino's rival, whose name is Themisto, to engineer this demand, because we don't imagine that the ghost of Phrixus really rose up over the tomb and demanded a sacrifice. We believe that this was a fabrication by the queen to set up the elimination of her rival's children. This is all very speculative, but if that's what happened, she would be doing exactly the same thing that Ino did in the Phrixus branch of the tradition. So you see, we've got this echo chamber of motifs, very satisfying to us. And so that's our idea about what that tomb is doing in line 15. And there may be a tomb mentioned in another piece of evidence for Ino too, and it would potentially support this hypothesis, but it's controversial whether it even belongs to Ino. That's another digression, so we'll leave that one at the moment.
Well, this is just all so exciting. Yvona, could I ask you to tell us a little bit maybe about just what's next? What's next with this papyrus? What's next with the excavation in Philadelphia? Is there hope that this is the maybe first of several, many, a few finds, not to make you jinx anything?
Well, I guess starting from the most mundane, John and I have several follow-up projects in addition to the edited volume that's coming out of the conference at CHS. There are several other interesting threads that we want to pursue, for instance, about how Ino was probably a more popular tragedy in the ancient world than we thought, and this is confirming some thoughts other people have had, in particular Patrick Finglass. So we have a couple of follow-up projects ourselves. I think very excitingly, BESM has received permission from the Ministry of Antiquities to set up an exhibition in the newly opened Greco-Roman Museum in Alexandria of the finds from Philadelphia. And in addition to this papyrus, there are mummy portraits, there are beautiful gabled roof coffins from the early Ptolemaic period. The site is incredibly rich, and the fact that there will be an exhibition devoted to the site and this papyrus will feature importantly there is incredibly exciting. And then BESM is, in fact, in Philadelphia as we speak. So hopefully there will be more papyri. Unlike Oxyrhynchus or Hermopolis Magna, there aren't very many literary papyri from Philadelphia. Of course, it's the home of the exceptionally important and famous Zenon archive, one of the most important documentary archives, but not much literature from Philadelphia, which I think is a coincidence. I don't think it's because people in Philadelphia were not reading. So statistically, well, I don't know whether that suggests that there will be literary papyri or not, but hopefully.
Could I ask you maybe to read a few lines?
I would love to do that. I would also like, once again, to just expand a little on something Yvona was just saying. We have a very exciting event coming up here in Boulder that I don't think we've talked about yet. And we have a dear friend, longtime benefactor of our department, who sponsors the Fountain Symposium on a nearly annual basis. And we're using the occasion this time to introduce our papyrus to a broader public. So we had the specialists in Washington. We're having specialists here in Boulder too, but their mandate is to speak, in a more public-facing fashion. And we expect a lot of attendance in person and via live stream. And this is coming up on Saturday, September 14th. And people can learn about it by going to the University of Colorado Classics website. We've got an exciting roster of speakers who are going to be expanding on topics we've barely touched on here. So there's a lot more to say, and we think both specialists and the general public are really going to enjoy it.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. So you'll be surprised, or maybe not, to learn that we picked the passage you've already talked about to read to you.
I mean, it's got dolphins in it, so...
It's got dolphins, right? And we had planned to read it first in Greek and then in English, but you read it in English, so maybe that won't be necessary.
Please, go ahead. I don't...
Okay. In that case, I should explain that this is a dialogue portion. We're quite confident that the first 7 lines, which are the ones you read before, are spoken by King Minos. But then there is a brief comeback by Poluidos. And so in the Greek version, I'm going to be Minos for 7 lines, and Yvona is going to speak the 8th, and then we're going to reverse it in the when we read out loud the English translation. So just so that that's all clear. We don't want to confuse people about who's who. So starting at the top of the line, and for the real specialists out there, the line at the top of the column is missing 2 syllables. Some good educated guesses have been made, but I won't speak them. So those who are really paying attention will notice that I'm going to speak only 11 syllables, because this is the one place in the papyrus where the name Poluidos occurs in Euripides' text, and apparently in a metrical position that explains why we're pronouncing it the way we do. So that's going to be the first word out of my mouth, is the name of our character. Minos talking to Poluidos. Poluide, tona nankaion brotoi sugestin alke, me dechu timoi logus. Horais, krate min pondios delphis halos, krate denoio nois in aetus thenos, enduranoid Zeus, intige tyrannides pleiston dinantai, tas demas sesum foras, hesogegota de ferein kratumenon.
Ukan tod orthos epes hos eleuthero. Poluidos, there is no defense against necessity for mortals. Don't receive my words in anger, don't you see? The ocean-dwelling dolphin rules the sea. Among birds, the eagle's strength rules. Zeus has greatest sway in heaven, tyrannies on land. Since you are of lower station, you must endure my misfortunes under compulsion.
You may not have said this properly, considering that I am a free man.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both so much. This has been just great. And if you won't mind indulging me a little bit, I have been asking people to end with a little bit of a word association game. I have just a few words written down, and I'll try to alternate or surprise a little bit who I ask to go first, but I'll ask both of you to respond to all of them. Okay, so the first one, Yvona, is Euripides. What's the first thing that comes to mind?
Papyrus.
John?
Most tragic.
Okay, well, John, now the word is papyrus.
Euripides.
I was hoping for that. Yvona?
Fun.
I thought you were going to say most comic. Okay, well, John again. Poluidos.
Deep trouble.
Yvona?
Seer. Boring, okay. I know. Sorry.
And Yvona again, I know.
Oh, murder.
John?
Goddess.
And the last one for you, John, is ZPE.
Exciting.
Ivana?
Cornelia.
Oh, that's
I
nice.
think for me, the first thing that would come to mind is yellow, actually.
Yeah.
It's very yellow. It's very yellow. Yeah.
I can't really play my own game, but I just had an image of yellow. So, well, thank you both so much. I really appreciate it. This is so exciting, and it's just so exciting to have you on the Lesche podcast. So thank you, and I think we're all looking forward to reading more from you and hearing more about this whole project.
Well, thank you so much for having us.
Yes, thank you. It's been fun.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Lesche podcast. And special thanks for their support of the podcast to Brown University's Department of Classical Studies and the John Carter Brown Center for Advanced Study. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. We look forward to you joining us again soon here in the Lesche.